And I don't know, hopefully it's not too annoying. I tend to like to keep my list of slides down the left side as I go so I can figure out where I am in the presentation rather than going into full screen mode. But yeah, today's presentation will be around crypto art history. So I always like to start by, having sort of a disclaimer that, of course, this version of crypto art history is going to be biased. It comes from my perspective as someone who came into the space in 2017 and met a lot of the early practitioners and spent several years writing. But of course, depending on who you talk to, you would get wildly different versions of what was important or how things unfolded in crypto art history. But hopefully this at least gives you some insight into my perspective and maybe a departure point to learn some more about the early history. I'll mention a few other folks who have sort of tried to capture some of this history towards the end to intentionally lead you towards some alternative perspectives. So who am I? My name's Jason Bailey. Most people know me as Artnome. I always start by saying I grew up in a family of engineers. My dad was an engineer, my older brother was an engineer, my younger brother was an engineer, and I was always really lousy at science and math and engineering, and all I ever wanted to do was be an artist. But I couldn't escape the fact that every conversation at breakfast, lunch, and dinner was around engineering. And even though I went to art school for painting, sculpture, and art history in the late 90s, I ultimately ended up working in tech for the next 20 years because it's sort of the family trade. And really, my life has been about trying to find ways to blend these two things, art and technology, that I was sort of born into. So today, I'm the CEO of a company called Club NFT that's designed to help collectors back up their NFTs. A lot of people don't realize, but something like 90% of NFTs, actually higher with Tezos, the files, the actual artworks themselves are off-chain. They're not on the blockchain, and you need to back them up. Otherwise, you're dependent on other people taking care of your NFTs. So I felt strongly enough about educating folks on this and giving them free tools to back their collections up to start a company last year. And as part of that company, we started Right-Click Save. Rather than having a boring company blog, I saw an opportunity to start a new publication that actually would treat NFT artists and NFT collectors with the same level of respect that traditional artists and collectors get. So particularly last year when NFTs became very popular, I was actually a little disappointed in my friends from the traditional art world and how unwelcoming they were to all of this. I think maybe they felt like they lost control of the narrative. So I thought there was a need between the media stories that focused on things like the Bored Apes and only the negative things, and then the traditional art world initially, they've come around, I think, but initially not really being all that friendly to this development. We felt like there was a need to start a publication, so that's rightclicksave.com. I sort of made my reputation on artnome.com, which is my personal blog where I started writing about AI and ML and artists and digital art and analytics and art history, all these weird nerdy things that I'm passionate about. I guess 6 or 7 years ago, I was lucky enough to grow a fairly large audience there. And then last year, beginning of last year, when NFTs took off, there was a moment where the conversation around sort of the environmental impact of NFTs, and we can get into that towards the end, was so loud that artists who are friends of mine that have been making NFTs for a few years, in some cases to feed their families during the pandemic, it got so bad that they were starting to get death threats because environmentalists, which I consider myself an environmentalist, were pushing so heavily back. So rather than take a side or add flames to the fire, I started Green NFTs to take all this energy from both sides and try to get people to work together. So we raised $100,000 and had 50 teams compete to try to think of ways to make NFTs a bit more efficient. So that's sort of my background. I think I usually like to start super high level with the assumption that people may not know much of anything about NFTs, and I like to sprinkle work from artists I respect and admire throughout the slides. So this is a work by Sarah Zucker from 2019 called What Now? And so what is an NFT and what's its application to digital art? So NFT stands for non-fungible token, though the word fungible can be a little bit tricky for some people. I guess, now that they've become so popular, maybe most people know what that means. But the way that I've described it, When something is fungible, I think about like a dollar bill. You know, if I have a dollar bill and you have a dollar bill, you're happy to swap my dollar bill for your dollar bill. That's fungibility. They're all worth essentially $1. But if I have a Picasso painting and you have a drawing, a crayon drawing from your child, you know, that's probably not an even trade. Like most people wouldn't be willing to make that trade. Those things are considered non-fungible. So they're unique and not necessarily interchangeable. So cryptocurrencies would be fungible. One Bitcoin's worth one Bitcoin, but NFTs would be non-fungible. So in addition to that, you have digital scarcity. We'll talk a bit about why that's important, but it's this idea that digital art through NFTs can be provably rare. There are only so many of the tokens made, and because that information is distributed across a ledger, it makes it very hard for people to forge or change that, which adds a sense of scarcity to digital work, which can be good and it can be bad. Immutable provenance. So again, this idea that you can sort of automatically tell every time an artist or an artwork changes hands, who owned it and how it changed hands and sort of what the chain of ownership was like. And then there's this idea of smart contracts and sort of an evolving interest in developing smart contract royalties, which is essentially code that gets executed at the point of the purchase of the NFT. So that's pretty high level, and then we go back in history to where things sort of start. I like to start with Bitcoin's Genesis block in 2009. So Bitcoin, again, high level stuff, but I'm assuming that there may be folks that are entirely new. It's this idea of a decentralized digital currency. It's attributed to Satoshi Nakamoto, which is like a pseudonym. People don't know if it's a woman, a man, a group, or who it is, so they're sort of a pseudonymous. And they created this system, sort of a peer-to-peer exchange where there's no centralized authority. It was particularly effective and popular when it came out because we had just had the 2008 crash, and a lot of people had less trust in sort of banks and governments and centralized authorities. So there was this sort of spirit in the air that people wanted, decentralized systems where you didn't have to depend on a single authority, and Bitcoin kind of landed into that atmosphere. Pretty early on, folks that got creative with Bitcoin and blockchain and started thinking about ways to embed images. A thing to know about blockchains in general is that they're actually really lousy at storing large files. A lot of times people are surprised to find out that more than 90% of NFTs actually store all the metadata and the images and the videos off-chain, because you hear all these great things about how great the blockchain is. But the blockchain's great for a lot of things, but not particularly good at storing medium and large files. It can cost thousands and thousands of dollars just to store a small file. So one of the ways people got around that early on and kind of embraced the limitation was to create ASCII art. This is a work that's a tribute to Len Sassaman that was created by Dan Kaminsky as early as 2011. I don't know that people were thinking about this as like great art at the time, but I include it because it's interesting to see that there's always this instinct whenever there's a new technology to try to figure out, how can we play with this and sort of explore and see different ways that we could make art. It's really 2014 that we start to see several people exploring more deeply the idea of creating tokens and using smart contracts and the blockchain for creating art. I think a lot of folks know Kevin McCoy created Monograph, and it was, I think, 2014 that he created what a lot of people consider to be the first NFT. Just so that people know, I'm not particularly hung up on what I call firstism. A lot of times people will fight and debate endlessly about what was the absolute first NFT. I kind of group these things into proto NFTs, and as with a lot of innovations, I don't think credit really should squarely go to any one person. I think there's a lot of people that are sort of thinking and developing and looking at it from different angles. Kevin is certainly very early and deserves credit. So I think Quantum is actually the name of this first NFT that he had created. But as you'll see, there are other folks around the same time period kind of attacking it from different angles. So also in 2014, Rhea Myers is looking at the smart contract itself as being an artwork. With this work, Ethereum, this contract is art. Rhea really is pretty consistent in creating work from 2014 on, including up to today. Really just making fascinating work that explores the blockchain as sort of a medium. And I think it comes more from sort of this background of almost like a school of conceptual art, right? Thinking about opportunities to create work around what ownership and decentralization mean through more of a conceptual lens. Nilly often gets left out. I kind of have made it my mission to make sure that I include Nilly. We already have a long history of people leaving women out of art history, traditional art history, and I think it's important that we do a better job of making sure that doesn't happen again with crypto art. So Nilly in 2014 is making and describing essentially modern NFTs and doing it on I think it's Bitcoin Talk. Yeah, so Bitcoin Talk was like where all the early cryptocurrency folks would hang out and talk about crypto. And she actually almost got kicked off, or I think may have gotten kicked off of Bitcoin Talk, because even though you would expect cryptocurrency people to be the most understanding of what she was trying to do, again, essentially describing and creating early NFTs, even the cryptocurrency folks were like, this sounds too wild and outrageous to be a real thing. So it's important to remember, it wasn't that long ago that even people that were sort of blockchain savvy weren't quite ready yet to accept this idea of sort of art and blockchain. She asked sort of this very interesting question, or it makes this interesting statement that money can change your life, but you can change what money is. So I always encourage folks to go learn more about Nilly Lerner's work. She way too often gets left out. Another work from around that time period in 2015 by Sarah Meojas, who maybe is a bit more popular, folks may be more familiar with. She created Bitcoin, and really the sort of to me the important part about this early work is she's sort of asking this question about what would happen if you were investing in the artist instead of the artwork itself. So she sort of sells off shares of these works that allow for access to her future created works, which I find personally fascinating. I've done some research and study around where the value or the price, I should say, for artwork in markets comes from. And so much of it really comes back to sort of the stories we tell ourselves about the artist, and much less than you would think or want or hope to do with the actual artwork. So I find it interesting that she's asking this question, that long ago, and I think it is sort of again, whether we like it or not, sort of a predecessor for how the markets in NFTs work today, where very often people want to buy an X copy or a this or a that, and the artwork is almost secondary to the desire to kind of be part of the cult of personality and participate in sort of the aura of a well-known artist. But I think it's important to point out there is a little bit of a tug of war already as we're trying to figure out how to define what matters in crypto art and what matters in NFTs. And a lot of my friends that I would say are from the more traditional art world are much more likely to point out artists like the ones we just described. So like Rhea Myers and Sarah Meojas and Kevin McCoy, who are sort of traditionally trained artists that are using the blockchain as a medium. And I think there's a push for that to become sort of the origins or the beginnings of crypto art. For me, I think those artists are very important, and their work. I really enjoy their work. But we've had artists that are sort of traditionally trained using technology and exploring technology for decades and decades, right? Arguably for thousands or hundreds of years, depending on how you define technology. So, and to be honest, while those works got some recognition, if it weren't for the explosion of interest in the mainstream around NFTs, I'm not so sure that we would be having classes like today or conversations like today where everybody's really excited about NFTs and their potential. I think credit for that actually needs to go to the early platforms. So a lot of times people have a hard time talking about Rare Pepe, and it often gets overlooked because at least in the United States, there was a 2 or 3 year period where it became synonymous with being a hate symbol. So when Donald Trump was running for presidency, there was sort of the extreme right adopted it, but it had a very long life before that, including being part of the first marketplace or the first highly adopted marketplace for artists using NFTs. So it was a Bitcoin-based marketplace, and there's a lot of core ideas or philosophies that come into Rare Pepe Wallet in 2016 that kind of lay the blueprint for successive marketplaces all the way up to today. And some of them, I think, are sort of the absolute ideal of what crypto art is. So in a way, Rare Pepe Wallet and Dada NYC, which we'll talk about later, for me, are sort of the high point of crypto art that we're still trying to get back to or reach. So what do I mean by that? With Rare Pepe Wallet, they actually didn't curate, so everybody was able to participate. So my simplest definition of what crypto art is an experiment around what happens when you let everybody participate, right? So there is no gatekeeping. Just the way that Bitcoin was trying to decentralize, finance when you had sort of gatekeepers and middlemen and bankers and things like that. Crypto art, by my definition, and again, we started by acknowledging that everyone can have their own history and their own definition, but for me, the thing that holds up historically and is significant is these systems and platforms are designed from the ground up to let everyone participate. So there was no curation. They tried very hard to fight any censorship. Anyone could participate, and 100% of primary and secondary royalties went to the artists. So there was no taking of fees from the artists, and this comes from sort of that almost crypto libertarian or decentralized theme, and a lot of these folks coming from a sort of a background in cryptocurrency. So this is started by Joe Looney, again, because of Rare Pepe has a mixed history. Unfortunately, Joe doesn't get as much credit as he should, in my opinion. Then we go to 2017, and we see the first artist market for Ethereum, so Curio cards. I think there's maybe a dozen or so artists initially on Curio cards, and very similar to the Rare Pepe wallet, Travis Uhrig, who starts Curio cards, is doing it on sort of a volunteer basis and is not taking any fees for primary or secondary sales. I think more recently, they figured out a way for him to get to share in part of the sort of resurgence of interest in Curio cards. But I'm fairly certain early on there was actually no fees being taken for Curio cards. And again, any artist that wanted to was able to participate. Of course, that's easy to say today when you have thousands and thousands and thousands of artists like knocking down the doors to try to get into marketplaces. But part of what I hope folks can understand as we walk through the history is for years, these marketplaces are like begging artists to come on to their platforms because it was sort of a very unusual idea that people weren't quite used to yet. So I think that might be why there was sort of only a limited number of artists. But this particular work is by Crypto Graffiti, who's very well known. I don't really include sort of the history of crypto art in terms of it being art that uses crypto symbols and cryptocurrency symbols in maybe non-digital ways. But Crypto Graffiti was known for sort of doing street art using cryptocurrency symbols and challenging banking and sort of as a way to sort of popularize the idea of cryptocurrency as a new thing. But I tend to focus largely on sort of the digital history. Also in 2017, we have CryptoPunks by Matt Hall and John Watkinson. This project has, in some ways unfairly, become a little bit of a joke because there have now been so many 10,000K PFP projects, so personal profile picture projects, that people see CryptoPunks sometimes and think like, oh, not PFPs, but you have to remember they weren't referencing anything. They invented this format, right? So it's like actually super, super innovative as a project and really clever in that they're combining generative art. So they don't draw all 10,000 of these images. They're using code to combine all these different features together. But the output is such a friendly looking and cute and fun project where people can kind of find one that looks like them that it was a lot easier for people that maybe saw generative art as something that nerds did, like me, that liked math and sort of abstract geometric work. This project not only invented the PFP format, which kind of helped later on popularize all of NFTs, but it's kind of like a Trojan horse and maybe like the earliest beginnings of the mainstream public getting excited about generative art on a large scale. So their follow-up project called Autoglyphs actually went hardcore. We don't talk about it so much here, but went hardcore into generative art and really brought a large number of people that was a new concept for into collecting generative art. So I mentioned Dada NYC a little bit earlier. Again, for me, my definition of crypto art is what happens when you build platforms and processes designed from the bottom up to allow everyone to participate, to minimize curation and censorship, and to push towards sort of artist-friendly systems where, again, with Rare Pepe, primary and secondary sales, all of it went to artists. With Dada, it's slightly different. So Dada was a platform where artists, well, is a platform that you can still use today, and many do, where you could create a drawing, and then anyone from around the world could sign up and extend your drawing. So they have these beautiful conversations where sort of internationally, people from around the world use their rather crude drawing tool to communicate with each other, and it sort of beautifully removes the idea that language is a barrier because we can all sort of speak visually. And they had built this platform that had tens and tens of thousands of artists sort of communicating with each other, but they were interested in trying to find ways to compensate the artists that they thought were sort of fair. So Bea very early on heard about CryptoPunks and Rare Pepe and some of these other works, and created a token system within Dada NYC. And their idea early on was, rather than recreate the old art world where a small number of artists get all the money and the rest of the artists can't get by, they wanted to sort of redistribute all funds evenly from all sales across all artists to make sure that there weren't perverse incentives, so that artists didn't feel like they just had to make whatever work would sell for the most. So really, really pioneering work. I consider Bea and Judy, who created Dada NYC along with Abraham Milano, as being sort of the heart and soul of the entire crypto art movement. As 2021 hit and it became much more about speculation, they were some of the loudest voices in explaining, like, why are we recreating the old system? The whole point was to build a more equitable system for artists from scratch. So late in 2017, you see Rare Art Labs come on. They're arguably the first professional or commercial NFT platform. So we had Curio Cards, we had Rare Pepe, we had Dada, but those are all largely sort of self-funded. And Rare Art Labs sees an opportunity with these early sort of prototypes to take some investment and hire a team and try to build sort of a professional platform. You can think of them almost like a predecessor to platforms like Known Origin or Super Rare, which came several months later. And importantly, John Zettler from Rare Art Labs got together with Joe Looney from Rare Pepe Wallet and Bea from Dada NYC and John and Matt from CryptoPunks. And they all decided to have this event in early 2018 that we'll talk about in a little bit, called the Rare AF Festival, which is, by most people's definition, I think, where crypto art as a movement really is born. But it's around late 2017 where I first come into the space. So this is where I can start to give you sort of firsthand experience, or share firsthand experience. So for me, I had already been writing about art and tech for a long time. I mean, I'd been in art my whole life and had my Artnome blog going for quite some time, but mostly was focusing on AI and ML. And a friend of mine, Ahmed Hosni, we went out for dinner for some pizza, and he said, this is late 2017, he said, Jason, you should really check out the blockchain. You're obsessed with provenance and trying to fight forgery, and you think that digital artists, are really struggling, your digital art friends, because of people just don't feel like that work is ownable and aren't taking it seriously. And, there's so many things that the blockchain kind of overlaps with your interests. And I actually said, I don't think the blockchain is going to be very interesting to me, because I think that's just about cryptocurrency. I mean, I just didn't know that much about it. And I'm like, and what do I care about currency? I'm really much more excited about art. But I have so much respect, had so much and still do for Ahmed Hosni, that I went home and the next day I spent a few hours doing research. So like everybody, I bought a few crypto punks. I think they were like probably $50 each back then, and they're like $500,000 now. And I bought some Dada NYC works, including this work by artist Mohara Gonzalez, who did actually the very first slide here as well. And it's really when I bought this work by Mohara that everything clicked for me. So it was probably like $5. I didn't really understand the system yet. And he tweeted me right away saying, thank you so much. It means so much to me that someone appreciates my art enough to want to buy it and to take interest. And, like, told me about his background. And we both learned that, we used to skateboard when we were younger. And we were talking about different skateboard artists and talking about Mezcal. And, 4 years later, we still check in probably every month or so. But it clicked with me, like, for the price of a cup of Starbucks coffee, I made a friend for life and was able to support another artist's creativity, like in a way that was sort of frictionless, that I hadn't been able to before, and it inspired me to write this article called "The Blockchain Art Market is Here," which is pretty ambitious considering I had only spent a couple hours doing research. But really, I called out some pretty key things before they were really happening. So I often get credit for predicting the explosion in NFTs, and really what it comes down to is this early article. I talked about how the blockchain could help drive digital art sales through digital scarcity. This all seems super obvious now, but it sounded crazy back then. People thought I was nuts, or a lot of people thought I was nuts. The idea that that NFTs, which we didn't call them NFTs until much later, but that the blockchain and art could democratize fine art investment. So I don't talk about this as much anymore. Actually, most people don't. But back in 2017, 2018, one of the things people were excited about is that you could take physical artworks that were maybe worth millions of dollars and fractionalize them. People were really excited about fractionalization of blockchain. So by fractionalizing them, maybe I can't buy, a Matisse or a Picasso, but I could buy, 1/1,000,000th of a share. So that was pretty popular back then. There's some people doing it today. I don't really like it as much because when you fractionalize a physical work that way, it kind of ceases to be art, and you have to kind of lock it away since it's now an investment across so many people. The third thing I called out was sort of improving provenance and reducing art forgery. So again, this idea that we talked about in the beginning, that when an artwork changes hands from owner to owner, it's automatically tracked in a way that's really hard to mess around with on the blockchain because it's distributed. So you don't have to worry as much about forgery or forgery of provenance. And then creating a more ethical way of paying artists. In that you could automate the royalties, and that maybe you could have a more active secondary market. So I wrote this article, went to bed, woke up the next day, and had literally hundreds of emails from people asking questions and inviting me to conferences, which I did not expect. I had very good SEO around art and technology from writing for years and years about it, and this was an absolute peak in sort of crypto mania and crypto interest in late 2017, which I also didn't really realize. So everyone that was searching for anything to do with art and blockchain was finding my article, and there was sort of an absence of experts. So I got invited to speak, around the world and travel and all these other things. And I had this moment where I was like, do I tell them I actually don't know anything, or do I accept all these opportunities and then go learn? So like any crazy person, I just said, yeah, I'll do all these things. And very quickly realized that I needed to go find the real experts so that I could learn from them. Otherwise, I was going to make myself look like a fool. So I was lucky in that conference that I mentioned, the Rare Art Festival, was underway. And it's really, in my opinion, a lot of sort of the foundational folks to crypto art came together in New York. And we thought initially it'd probably be like 20 nerds from around the world that had this weird random hobby meeting up. And we got there and it became pretty clear early on that hundreds and hundreds of people had flown in from all around the world, and there was this whole like zeitgeist and energy. Like literally, if you're an art history nerd like me, you've probably wondered what was it like when like abstract expressionism was born or surrealism was born, and this literally had that feel like in that room that day, right? Like the presentations that were being given, and the people from all around the world coming together with different ideas but respecting each other's background. And that's where I met and became close friends with Matt and John and Bea and Joe and so many other folks that helped me learn about the history of crypto art. So I saw my role, I fell in love with this group of creatives that were honestly trying to build an entirely new art world from scratch. They felt like the art world had left so many people behind, and it was so narrow and so centralized that what do we have to lose? And it resonated with me as someone who spent a quarter of their life in art school for undergrad and graduate school. I know thousands of artists personally from school, and I don't know one that makes art full time, or I hadn't up until NFTs hit. And I thought, well, who is this system serving, right? Certainly not serving anyone I know, and I've spent a quarter of my life in art. So I decided my role would be to help to write about the space, and I wrote this article called "What is Crypto Art?" It's really my first attempt to try to define. I think anyone's first attempt to try to define crypto art as a serious art movement in 2018. I won't go through all of this. You can all find it on artnome.com. I do think I got a lot right, maybe not everything right, but it really focuses on how the goal is to let everybody participate, and to sort of de-emphasize traditional training and skill. So it's not just about celebrating, who the quote unquote best artists are, or the ones with the most experience, but shifting emphasis to inclusion and celebrating expressivity, which can be, anyone can be expressive. I include this just because it's again hard for people to realize how unpopular or unknown NFTs were. Another article I wrote in 2018 was called "Blockchain Artists Wanted," where I talked about how I made a rare Pepe myself, just as an experiment to write about, and didn't think anyone was going to buy one of them. And I had spent my life making art, and it only ever sold like one print for $200 or something. So I came back a week later, just on a whim, after making a single rare Pepe, and saw that I had made $800 in sales, and knew again that now as an artist that there was something there. I mean, this isn't like I intentionally made this as low quality as possible because I thought, well, that's the aesthetic or whatever. So it's like not my proudest moment in terms of art, but my point was like, hey, there's this huge group of people that are fascinated by this new format of art and willing to invest in it and support it. Artists should start to take notice, and I sort of pointed artists towards a bunch of different platforms to try to get them excited. And around that time, a bunch of marketplaces started to launch. So Super Rare and Known Origin shortly after that were sort of two of the bigger ones. And they were, again, because these folks that were creating the platforms didn't necessarily come from an art background, they were thinking about paying artists to try to be on the platform because they didn't have all the connections to the artists. When they did talk to artists were like, what are you even talking about? Like a blockchain? I don't know what you're saying. So my role early on was to make a lot of the connections for the marketplaces to artists. So I had been following Robbie Barrett, who is an AI ML artist who's like 17 or 18 years old, and was completely in love with his work, and asked him if and Super Rare if they would be willing to have him as the first artist on their platform, so that I could collect his work, because I sincerely wanted a new way to collect digital work, and it seemed like they were really building a great platform. So that's how I became the first collector on Super Rare. And it went pretty well in the beginning, and we decided that we would create. I had been offered to fly to Christie's in London and give a presentation about NFTs, again before we were calling them NFTs. And we decided the best way to teach people would be to give away these cards at Christie's. So we brought 300 cards that each you could scratch away and claim an NFT. And sort of somewhat famously now, on stage, I told this giant room full of traditional art collectors, hey everybody, digital art's the future. This is the way people are going to collect digital art in the future. You're getting a free NFT in your goodie bag. Do not throw it away. I know I'm giving it to you, but I will buy it back from you if you do not want it. And the reason I include this story is because, I mean, look at the date, 2018. It's not that long ago, right? 40 years ago. And people were literally yawning and getting up and walking out because the traditional art collectors, forget NFTs, the bulk of them had zero interest in digital art in general. They were kind of, the attitude was kind of like, who let these weirdos in, right? So fast forward, in I think 275 out of the 300 NFTs we gave away are unaccounted for. We just assume they got thrown away. But when they are found, they've sold for anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million. My emphasis is much more on art, not so much on money, but I do think it's kind of hilarious that I accidentally created essentially a $300 million giveaway, which is sort of ridiculous. So what were they talking about back then? A lot of the early talk about blockchain from the traditional art world was mostly about provenance in physical artworks. So I was also on this panel with several folks that were sort of looking at building custom distributed ledgers to track physical artworks rather than digital artworks. So it's really not until much later and through a lot of sort of fighting that the digital artists start to get the recognition, and we see the NFT format really emerge. So the way I like to tell the story, you know, in terms of how the community came together and how things moved in those early years is through rare AFs, right? So now we have every single month it feels like there's like 20 NFT conferences in major cities around the world. In the beginning, there was pretty much just rare AF. There was rare AF 1 that we talked about in New York. And the question in rare AF 1 is, can we find any artists? Well, like, you know, literally these platforms were coming out and could not find artists, right? So that first year, 2018, was about like recruiting artists and trying to educate them and help them understand what NFTs were. But by Rare AF2, the crypto markets had crashed, and really we had all these artists now and all this work just sitting there dormant on all the platforms, and nobody was really buying anything. So, you know, 2019 at Rare AF2, we're literally asking each other, like, is this even going to be a thing next year, right? There's interviews, like recorded interviews with everyone. You know, it was like a third of the people showed up, and we're all kind of down, and we're like, yeah, you know, this NFT thing's probably not going to work because there's just not enough collectors coming in. So we really had to push in 2019, and it's really thanks to a dozen or so whales. So we use the term whales to describe wealthier collectors who came in and were willing to buy and support this idea of early NFTs and support artists when, you know, most people thought it was kind of ridiculous, but they kind of put in the lifeblood to keep it going through 2019 and into early 2020. Then by the time we got to 2020 Rare AF, the big question was like, okay, now we have the artists and we have the collectors, you know, not that many, but still we have some collectors, and the traditional art world is still making fun of us and kind of saying, well, yeah, you've sold these things once, but you don't really have a market until you have a secondary market, right? There has to be some signs that you can both buy the work and then find a way to sell it again. Otherwise, people are just stuck with this stuff, right? So it's in 2020, actually, that some of the early collectors like myself started being willing to sell some of the early works. So, you know, because we got in early, we had some of the earliest works. And the newer collectors that had deeper pockets were willing to spend more. And while we didn't necessarily want to part with the work, the works that we had in our collections that we loved, we were willing to do it in part, honestly, because we needed to show that there was activity in a secondary market. And, you know, that's sort of the early rumblings that there could be something here that's more than just a handful of nerds. So fast forward to 2021. Up until that point, it's really just, you know, a couple dozen altruistic art nerds working together, trying to build a new art world. And then Christie's Beeple sale hits, and like everything gets turned upside down. So I'm sure everybody knows about the sale, but the artist Beeple sold a work for $70 million, an NFT for $70 million in 2021. And the whole world came in and learned about NFTs, but unfortunately, they didn't learn about NFTs the way we were trying to teach people, which is that this is a new way for artists to be able to sort of take control of their careers and get, you know, compensated and like include artists from all different geographies. Instead, what they saw or what they learned about NFTs was, oh, well, here's a white tech artist who, you know, used a 200-year-old auction house to make $70 million. Sure looks like the old traditional art world to us. We don't see anything new here, but it did drive a lot of interest. So it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? Like, maybe not the message that we would have wanted ideally for the entire world to see as an introduction to NFTs, because it's sort of the opposite of what we were trying to build and promote. But on the same side, our message was never going to grow as fast as news of a giant sale, right? So that just became the way that everyone sort of got the 2021 NFT mania. You start seeing it on like Saturday Night Live. Like you can't go anywhere without seeing people talking about like what the heck are NFTs, and it feels pretty surreal to those of us that have been collecting and you know, the artists that were in the space and writing about it and building the space up until this point, because here's this nerdy random thing that we cared about that we thought no one would ever care about, and now you can't look anywhere without seeing it literally everywhere. You know, people are spending crazy money on it, and like huge debates are coming out. So part of those debates are about the environmental issues, which a lot of us were actually pretty blind to until Memo Igden, who's an AI/ML generative artist, sort of did the research and said like, hey guys, like in early 2021, you know, these NFTs may not actually be great for the environment, particularly the ones that use proof of work systems. And I think he had the best of intentions and did us a favor in drawing attention to it. But as I mentioned in the beginning, it sort of turned into this really horrible scenario where artists were getting like death threats, and like people that we weren't seeing anything get better. We were just seeing people get angry and talking across each other. So being that I consider myself an environmentalist, and I love the space and saw so many artists being able to feed their families as a result of NFTs, I sort of threw out this tweet that said, hey, you know, if I kickstarted the bounty and threw some money and some time in, who would be willing and interested in participating? And the one thing to say is this really is an amazing community. People jumped in right away. Artists started donating works to raise money. We quickly raised $100,000 and put together 50 teams, and we've got 5 actual follow-up teams right now for a second cohort. And of course, I know that, you know, this small sort of community initiative isn't going to solve the whole problem, but the idea is that the community needs to take ownership, right, over these problems, and we need to work together to try to find a way to improve. If we really want to build a better system, we can't just fight each other. We need to find a way to use all that energy, human energy, to try to improve the system. And sort of as a direct result of the debates around sort of green NFTs and the environmental issues, Hic Nunc comes out in early 2021, and it's on a green NFT platform, Tezos, and a lot of these digital sort of classical generative artists, you know, or classically trained digital artists who didn't really want to touch NFTs back when like ICOs were going on, and thought like, well, crypto sounds kind of dirty, and like, I don't know, isn't this just monetizing art, or isn't this a pyramid scheme, or all the things that you hear about. When Hic Nunc came out, it sort of gave these more classically trained digital artists a cleaner way for them to start participating, right? So I actually really value and appreciate all the artists that came before Hic Nunc, and folks that, you know, that didn't necessarily have the traditional training. But it was pretty exciting as someone who really loves generative art to see folks like Mario Klingemann and Casey Reese and Leah, you know, people I've been following for 10, 20 years that are more on the digital and generative art side coming into the space. And of course, last year and even currently, throughout this entire thing, we've had, you know, every other day, people are writing the obituary for NFTs. One thing you'll learn if you're in this space for a while is you just ignore it. Particularly last year, like one day you would see something saying that NFTs were completely dead, and then the very next day you would see that there were like record-breaking sales. It's just the inherent volatility of crypto, and NFTs, for better or for worse, are tied to that volatility. And the news media cycles and the average person aren't really wired to be able to keep up with that volatility. So usually by the time the story comes out, the opposite of what they're reporting on is sort of happening. Other big trends, real quickly, that we saw last year, we kind of take it for granted now that generative art has just been a big part of NFTs. That was not really true in a major way up until last summer-ish. The story I tell is that my deep passions are really around NFTs and generative art, and have been, you know, NFTs for 4 or 5 years, generative art for 20 or 25 years, and no one ever wanted to talk to me about either of those things until last summer. And then I wake up one day and it's like, all over the news everywhere. Everyone I talked to was just like, yay, we love generative art, we love NFTs. And I was just like, this is such a weird world where like these nerdy hobbies of mine have become so big. It's the analogy I use is like if you were into something really obscure like snail racing, and no one ever wanted to talk about snail racing, and then one day you wake up and the whole world is just like, we love snail racing. So yeah, it was really exciting to see generative art kind of come into the NFT space, and I think it's continued to grow through things like FX Hash on the Tezos side. And then, of course, PFP Mania, which sadly I think has become sort of synonymous with what the average person thinks of when they think of NFTs. It's not that I hate PFPs. I think they're cool in terms of a collectible. It's not my thing, but a lot of people are really into it. It's just sad that it sort of drowns out any other narrative about sort of the intersection of art and NFTs. This is sort of a silly graph that I created because people always get nervous. They're like, well, what's going to happen if there's a bear market and people aren't interested in NFTs anymore? What's going to happen if there's a crash? And my point as someone who's just been around in the space for a very long time is that all the coolest projects are always born during the dips. When there's hype going on, people are so busy racing trying to sell stuff that there's not really enough time to make, thoughtful art or to build interesting platforms or to innovate. And when there's a crash, people can slow down a little bit and kind of build things out. And while you lose sort of the speculators every time there's a crash, the core community actually grows over time. So that's just an observation that I've seen over the last 4 years. This is an old tweet that I include because I think it summarizes why it's sort of inevitable that NFTs or some similar format will take off. Our generation's culture is largely digital. NFTs let us preserve and collect that history the way previous generations did with analog history. It sometimes looks clunky because the solutions aren't perfect yet, and we're in this transitional period, but the train has left the station. So beyond just artists getting paid and me loving digital art, we live increasingly in a digital society where our culture is digital and at risk if we don't find ways to become better stewards of it. And I think collectability and ownership, while maybe not the perfect, some people would say, well, that's backwards. You shouldn't have to own things to preserve them. But I do think a sense of ownership, or at least a sense of uniqueness or significance or stewardship being applied to our digital culture is pretty important. And I think NFTs can help move us in that direction. I get a lot of questions now that NFTs are really crowded from artists that are coming into the space, which I think a lot of you are. About like how can I be successful in this space? And really a lot of times what that question is how can I sell NFTs? And this is sort of my Kennedy version quote for crypto art, which is ask not what crypto art can do for you, but what you can do for crypto art. So going back to the beginning days of crypto art, people would come in and volunteer and help and promote each other's work. And it's really the folks who I've seen that have become successful are very often the folks that come in and try to meaningfully help move the infrastructure forward or move the community forward or help, support other artists. And so the question really is, rather than come in and trying to figure out how to extract as much value as you can, try to figure out how to contribute. And ironically, that'll actually help in terms of being successful in the space. Another thing that I bring up a lot is patience and humility. So, maybe they try for a month or 2 months to sell their work or to find an audience or a group of collectors and can't do it. And they feel like, well, NFTs are broken or this whole system sucks. One of the things to know, Xcopy, probably the most popular successful artist by many measures in the space, I bought his first work for £1, essentially $1. And the other ones just sat there and no one wanted them for years. You could buy Xcopy works for like $5 like a year and a half, 2 years ago. And now you can't buy them for less than millions of dollars for single editions. Now his work didn't change. It's just as good or bad if you don't like it, as it was 2 or 3 years ago. What changed is, he was persistent and over time, by sharing his work was able to build up an audience. Similarly, Sarah Zucker's work, she's a very successful artist in the space now as well, sat unsold for a better part of a year and a half. And when I was able to sell one of the other works I had and get some money, I picked up a bunch of Sarah's early work and sort of started an avalanche of other people collecting it. But again, her work was always great and I always wanted it. I didn't have the money. And then once I bought it, it became, sort of started this avalanche. Not to take credit, she deserves all the credit. But it's that her work, these artists' work was always good. and it's just a matter of time before the collectors find it. And now it's a lot louder and noisier. So it takes some patience and some humility, and don't expect instant success. And try to appreciate and value the community and the friendships and the opportunity to share. And maybe not the sales will follow, but it's not something that sort of automatically happens or ever happens for some people, if we're being honest. Another thing that I like to talk about, so in the early days, not so much anymore, but in the early days there was a ton of conversation where collectors in particular that were sort of new to collecting art would tell artists to make less work, which I found to be extremely obnoxious. There's few worse sins in my book than telling artists to make less work. I mean, the whole point of artists is to fill our world with art. Think about how sad it would be if some of the great artists in history had been told to make less work and just stop making work. We wouldn't have the availability of the work. So, I mean, make as much or as little as you want, but completely tune out anybody who's telling you like, oh, you're minting too much or you're making too much. I wrote an article called How to Be a Successful Artist that uses a bunch of data to explain why you actually can't flood your own market. So you can go and check that out if you're having concerns. But ultimately, do what comes natural for you and ignore collectors or platforms that are trying to tell you to make less work, please. And lastly, another great spot to go to get the history of crypto art. Martin Lucas Ostachowski is an artist and historian in the crypto art space. There are lots of folks out there that are now writing about it, and I encourage you to talk to as many as you can. So not sure how much I ran over or under, but I think I've got time to take questions if folks are interested, and hopefully you all found that helpful as sort of a crash course in the history of crypto art.
Thank you so much. I can never get tired of listening to this. It's so inspiring to see how different some things are than what the general population believes or accepts they are. And in a way, I feel like the way that you present the things that you present just always makes me feel like there is so much more to discover for all of us, and just inspires me to do more. Any questions from anybody?
That's the question.
Sure.
Do you guys hear me? Yeah. Thanks, Jason. That was very enlightening. Like, it was very great to hear all this journey. I didn't even know it went that far to 2011. That's foundations. It's pretty surprising. So my question is, I know it's kind of maybe a long question to answer, and you could just go whatever you want. But I'm wondering, so what do you envision for the future of the ecosystem, with the way things are happening now, the way collectors are behaving, the way markets behaving, and the way artists are behaving? And also another question that may be also long, but it pops on my head is what can we do as artists to empower these core values that are healthy for the ecosystem and that are really necessary if we want this to be a long-term a place for everyone. So yeah, that's kind of my question. I don't know if that resonates too much.
No, I think that's fantastic. I mean, I can tell you, whenever I make predictions, I kind of secretly am saying what I want to happen often. So that's sort of the disclaimer. But I think what we need to see sort of happen is what I wanted to see in the very beginning, which is that instead of it going to individual artworks by artists going more and more and more expensive, which means fewer and fewer people can afford to collect them, I'm hoping that we actually move eventually to a system where if an artist creates an artwork, rather than being obsessed with ownership and collectors fighting each other to drive the price up to own this thing that we can all see for free, let's be honest, in a way, NFTs are kind of absurd, right? It's sort of this ego battle to say that you own something when in reality we can all see it for free. Where I'd love to see it go is that instead of one artist with lots of money being able to win the contest to own this artwork, I'd love to see thousands of collectors or appreciators even, let's just call them, moving towards almost like a tipping system, right? Where everybody can kind of just say thank you for the artist for creating the work and give a very small amount of cryptocurrency. One of the neat things about crypto is that you can kind of economically give smaller amounts of money. So I want to see artists continue to make money, but I want to see a wider range of artists make money. And avoid this system where we get to just a small number of individuals, really dominating the market. How would we get there? And how do I actually think this is possible as a legit prediction versus just what I want? I think that at the rate we're going, if you look at how much art is being collected and how much is being spent, I mean, sure, there are a lot of new collectors, and maybe that's part of it. But I think we're probably a little bit overheated, to be honest, in terms of how much art is being sold. So I kind of expect an art market crash, a digital art market crash to happen. And I think out of that crash, we'll learn from the old system where there's just a small number of wealthy people competing with each other to replicate the old system. And perhaps we'll have a more distributed system where lots and lots of people can give their appreciation for a work without having to feel like they collected it instead of someone else. I know that's pretty wild in terms of an interpretation, and it can seem like it might be a threat to artists, but I actually think it's a better, more distributed way for people to show their gratitude.
I think it already happened in the bear market that we've seen a lot of, leaving. Filter some stuff, I feel, and also gave more time and less noise for artists to really focus. I mean, the financial thing is another part of it, because I know a lot of people struggle a lot also. But I think, it's necessary, like you're saying,
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Appreciate it, Franco. Any other questions? Don't be shy. I'll at least try to answer anything.
I think so in the chat already. There are some questions.
In the chat. All right, let me see. I have a question. How you think films and NFTs can evolve and integrate as a pillar of the future of cinema in the crypto space? So I'm not an expert in this space, but I do know in the last 20 years, the cost of making movies has gone down dramatically with sort of affordable editing suites, and even our phone cameras have a decent way of taking footage. So I think the number of people who can create in that format has gone up dramatically, and I think it's a format that's not super foreign to folks in terms of how to consume it. So I actually think it's the kind of thing where we probably need a builder. The builders often don't get enough credit. So when I say builder, I mean like the engineers that make these marketplaces. So many artists get so angry and are often mean on social media to the people that build these platforms. But it's the platforms that sort of become the playgrounds for the artists. So I think I would not be surprised at all if someone built a cinema-themed, maybe it's already out there, a micro cinema-themed NFT platform. And I think once that platform's there and sort of specializes in accepting and promoting and getting the word out about that kind of work, I think it would do very well. I'm not sure that fully answers the question, but I think it's a matter of the spirit in this community has always been, if you have an idea or you want to see something happen, that you can work together to sort of manifest it or to build it. I think I've got, I don't know if you had a question, Jonas? Or maybe you just need to go on mute. Another question here, let's see. In your view, what is the relationship with NFTs and crypto?
Sorry, it was by mistake.
No worries. What is the relationship with NFT and crypto art now that the traditional art world, will these two fields stay separate for a while? So I've been, the best thing maybe, or one of the best things about this crash in the bear market is that my friends from the traditional art world seem like they're finally starting to relax and see the opportunities here, right? I do think what happened is last year there was just so much garbage news and press about people getting like screwed over and like having their NFT stolen or their art stolen, or the environmental impact or the pyramid scheme. It's just like this nonstop barrage of negativity that combined with maybe traditional art folks feeling like they lost control of the narrative made it surprisingly a lot of friction last year, in my opinion. But now we're starting to see more of the traditional art brands, as well as, more importantly, the digital art and traditional art academics, seeing things like, particularly maybe like Hicat Nunk and Tezos, where it's maybe slightly less hype-driven and more diverse, seeing that really there are amazing opportunities here. And by the way, if you don't like what you see, that you can change it, right? So I also think publications like Outland and Selfishly right-click save are really helping to grow a bridge between sort of the crypto art NFT community and the traditional art community. So I think, just the same way that we're not obsessed with the internet or websites as much as we were in the very beginning, we kind of understand the technology now. As we get more familiar with blockchain and NFTs as a technology, I think they'll be less polarizing, and people will just continue to explore uses that align with their own values. Let's see. So the idea of social tokens for artists, I'm not sure if that's, I think that's more of a follow-up than a question. Ignis, let's see. Because nowadays, as you said, the amount of data we can store in a blockchain is really small. Yeah, so I think that's in relation to the cinema. For cinematic NFTs, you would have to store them off-chain, but that's fine. That's actually, again, 90% plus of NFTs store all their files off-chain anyway. You would want to look at something like IPFS is a great way to store large files off-chain. Did I miss any other questions? Let's see. Is there any answer to linking physical?
Can I ask one question?
Yeah, sure.
So what do you think about, I'm just seeing a lot of like physical spaces that they're opening as NFT galleries, but they're a physical space. For a system that is already like working and embracing like the digital, is this really necessary to happen, and why are they all opening at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So I think part of what happened is the NFTs, I didn't talk about it in the presentation much, but NFTs got a major boost during the pandemic because it was hard to go to physical places. Like a lot of them were shut down, right? So we had this desire to support artists and to share and collect, and it just happened to overlap the explosion largely with the pandemic. For a lot of folks, experiencing and appreciating art is actually a social activity, right? And they enjoy the idea of being able to come together in a physical space, even if it's looking at a digital work, so that they can have a conversation and share and relish in the opportunity to share their common interests around art. And I think that's what's driving, a lot of people, that urge was pent up because they didn't get to do it during the pandemic. And there's an opportunity to do that. But I also think another half of the answer there, or the reasoning, is that you kind of have to meet people where they are. And traditional art world collectors, particularly older folks, like I would put my parents in this group, it is pretty wild, this idea that they're like, wait a minute, son, you're spending like thousands of dollars on a JPEG you can see for free on a screen already, right? It's like, it's pretty hard for like the traditional art collectors to understand how any of this works. So getting them in a physical gallery where you're sort of meeting them halfway. For them, art is like a thing you hang on the wall a lot of times, right? So you hang the thing on the wall in a physical space and you get them there, and then you can kind of slowly hold their hand and walk them to this idea that, like, for a long time, art didn't even have to be a physical thing. Like, we've already kind of accepted that conceptual art is a thing going back decades, but most people don't have that background. So I think this physical thing is a way for people to be social, but also a way to onboard the masses of traditional art collectors who maybe are curious, but just can't get past some of the tech barriers.
You would say it's more like a bridge, like for like keep exchanging these ideas and presenting.
Yeah, and one of the things I hope that happens, obviously digital art and art that uses technology goes well beyond things that can be shown on a screen, right? I love all kinds of like sort of physical digital art, and maybe some of these NFT galleries will start to show work that really does warrant being in a physical space and goes beyond just a flat screen. So maybe we'll see some more innovation as a result.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Let's see.
Fabulous. There is another question here. Is there an answer to linking the physical artwork with the NFT artwork?
Yeah, I mean, I still look at this space as a big playground. So people have been making tags that you can put on a physical artwork as a way to track the provenance using blockchain going back 4 or 5 years. I don't know that any of those companies have been super successful. As we've moved more and more towards the digital, I think what happened is most people would argue, well, there's always been a market for physical art, right? So the thing that's particularly exciting to most folks right now is having solved this problem of making digital art feel ownable to the masses. So much attention has gone to that maybe the conversation around ways to integrate physical and digital art have kind of died down. But I'm much less interested because, again, has to have been at least 24 companies that have worked on ways to put like unique tags that you can scan that like, allow you to track a physical work on a blockchain. That's not super exciting to me as like a broad commercial solution. But when individual artists actually integrate the process of physical art and digital art in a meaningful way as part of the artwork, rather than a sticker that gets slapped on at the end, sometimes you see some pretty interesting results. So I'd encourage folks to explore and pioneer ways to kind of combine the two that kind of are additive to the work rather than just like something that kind of gets slapped on at the end.
There was actually a very, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. It just and to add on to that, would you having a physical piece and an augmented reality associated with it that you could see the artwork on the wall and then just with your phone use it, or incorporate it as in the in the crypto art itself, as in I don't know how to explain it, as an NFT having been combined with a physical and digital technology. What do you mean by combining the physical and the digital art?
Yeah, is that a question for me or a question for the person who asked the question originally?
That's I think for you, and yeah, for you. I think you're the
Yeah.
one that know more up here, so it goes to you.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know that I have a particular solution, but what's kind of interesting, if you remember back to the slide that I showed from Curio Cards, I talked about an artist named Crypto Graffiti. So, Crypto Graffiti's been making work since I think 2013, like way back. And Crypto Graffiti's work was physical work, like often like collage or paintings that he would put out on buildings, sometimes the side of banks that had those QR codes on them where people could like sort of tip or things like that. So there's actually kind of a long history of different ways to integrate it. I don't know that I'm the best person to like prescribe one specific way to combine them. Of course, there's lots of different things you could do, whether it's AR, VR, QR codes. So I would encourage you to sort of go and explore yourself. But there's certainly lots of interesting and meaningful ways to incorporate the two. I guess my push or my ask, not that it matters, it's just my personal opinion, is that these things are much more interesting when they're done as part of the art process. So rather than just thinking about like, well, how can I take my work, which is my work, and just smash it into becoming an NFT or just like adding it as an afterthought. I always think it's far more fascinating when you become like genuinely curious about the technology and its capabilities and dive in deep and figure out how to overlay the mode of presentation and the integration of the technology into sort of the primary themes and working, mode that you have as an artist. That's just my opinion. Like lots of people probably have different opinions. So yeah, that may not be as helpful as you wanted, but essentially suggesting that it's worth doing the research and probably not super helpful for me to give sort of a singular answer. I see a question from Victor. Let's see. 2 questions. Any words on the Abramovich drop? Is it true that Tezos blockchain where the art is shining, or is there something I'm missing? So I think the Abramovich drop was great. We actually did an interview with Maria Abramovich. For folks that don't know, she's a major pioneer in performance art, probably one of the most important living artists in terms of traditional art history, the canon of traditional art history. I think it was done authentically, the Abramovich drop, which I appreciate. I do think there are some sort of famous artists that just see dollar signs and come in and don't really even understand what NFTs are, but they're just like, oh, here's a way I can sell more crap. So I appreciate whenever traditional artists that work in analog mediums or mediums that maybe are a little bit more distant from NFTs take the time and put in the energy to do sort of an authentic drop. Again, this almost goes to my last question, where they're integrating the technology and understanding it as part of their practice, rather than just using it purely as sort of a selling mechanism at the end. So I was glad to see that. And then, is it true Tezos blockchain is where the art is shining? So here are my thoughts on Tezos. I mean, it's where I've been collecting for the last year mostly, and it's for pretty practical reasons. The gas fees, which are the fees that you pay to buy, just to transact on Ethereum, last year got so high that often I would have to spend $100 or $150 just to, not for the artwork itself, but just to buy, to transact. And then there was the cost of the artwork on top of that. So for someone like me who wants to collect like almost every day and support dozens and dozens of artists, there's just no way I can do that with the money that I have on a platform like Ethereum. And I think there are whole sections of the world where the idea of spending $100 to transact, to mint a work or to buy a work, just excludes entire, large masses of people that just don't have that kind of money. Honestly, myself included. And Tezos drops that bar so low. The gas fees are so low, and the ease of getting on is so low. Combined with the fact that some of the best known and most respected artists started to come into that platform last year, really did make it an exciting space. So there are still a lot of people that feel like they do their less, expensive work on Tezos and then maybe do their more expensive work on Ethereum. I don't really understand that, other than maybe people are just used to spending more. I do see that sometimes as a trend. But yeah, Tezos is exciting because, in a shorter answer, it's reduced the barrier to entry and dramatically increased the number of people that can participate. So the quality of work and the availability to collectors goes up. Let's see, Jonas Bo, do you think in 10 years it's going to be completely normal for artists to mint NFTs? That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it goes the way that, say, like, maybe it'll be as normal for artists to mint NFTs as it is for them to have websites. But I think we'll always have artists that are largely working in analog mediums. And again, to the question that was 2 questions earlier, I don't think every painter or printmaker has to go into digital. Like, I don't want to live in a world where it's like the pressure because NFTs are selling well, every single analog artist now feels like even if they don't want to, they have to become a digital artist. So I guess my answer would be that I don't think it'll be normal for every artist to mint NFTs. I really think it's optimized to solve this problem of digital art feeling like it's not saleable, and that we already kind of have mature systems for artists that work purely analog. Let's see. Another question. We've seen a huge explosion of interest in poetry, and as you said, Gen art on the blockchain in the last little bit. What other art forms are you excited about, or do you think will be important emerging in future markets? So yeah, it's been interesting. It actually was surprising to me how long it took for photography to take off. I wrote about photography and NFTs in early 2018 or late 2017. And I thought, well, this is such like a widely spread medium, and it's natively digital now, so we should see an explosion in photography. And it wasn't really till last summer that photography kind of took off. I've been thrilled to see poetry take off. And again, it's not an accident. There's sort of a core group of poets that are working really hard to kind of explore and establish and get the news out about poetry as NFTs. So it's been great to see it, because that's the spirit that crypto art's always had, where if you want a thing, don't complain about it, help make it happen. So to answer the question, what am I excited about in terms of future things? I would like to see all these boundaries that we have between different things melt away a little bit. So, there's sort of photography or still images or generative art or music or gaming or poetry. The cool thing, my master's thesis, I'm an old man, so it was a long time ago, but really talked about how when you're working primarily digitally, these artificial barriers that we carry over from sort of the analog or physical world are really kind of unnecessary, right? And we can actually make things that sort of bleed in between gaming and music and visual art and cinema and poetry. I'm eager to see NFTs where you see something that gets created and you're actually not quite sure how to classify it, because I don't think we have to stay in these swim lanes anymore. Hopefully that helps answer that question. Let's see. Another question. Do you think the ETH merge that they keep talking about is going to alter a lot of the issues, gas fees of that particular chain? Do you think we'll see a lowering of barrier to entry on ETH for artists and collectors? I've only minted on ETH so far, also, but only in a bear market. So yeah, I'm not a maxi. So for people that don't know what a maxi is short for maximalist. That's someone who's like religious about only using like one chain and saying all the other chains are not good. I actually started collecting in Ethereum and helped. I mean, not to be like to take too much credit, but kind of helped popularize the idea of Ethereum NFTs, at least within the art world. So I don't have anything against ETH. A lot of my friends started the platforms in Ethereum. I'm thrilled that they're moving towards proof of stake instead of proof of work, because I think it is better for the environment. They have been saying they're going to do that for 5-6 years, I think, something like that. So it'll be exciting to actually see it happen, and I think I'll personally be more likely to collect again more aggressively on ETH when that happens. I'm not technical enough to say for sure the impact that it'll have on gas fees. I'm not so sure that, and this, I'm hesitant to even say this because it's outside my league. I'm not so sure that moving to proof of stake necessarily does away with gas fees on Ethereum. My understanding was that it was somewhat tied to the congestion around how many people are using the blockchain, but don't quote me on that one. So I'm certainly interested to see where it goes, though. Let's see, any recommendation on something fresh and new that are starting now that we can check out? What's fresh and new? Well, someone already mentioned poetry is sort of an exciting and new direction that things seem to be going in. I mean, I try not to shill too much, but I could plug. My company is building out a new tool to help people discover artists that they aren't collecting yet on Tezos. So one of my big concerns is that I look at how everyone's kind of following the leader, and just if someone well-known collects an artist, everyone else just kind of follows them and collects that same artist. So we've intentionally engineered a tool that goes and looks at what you collect, looks at what everyone you also collect, or sorry, everyone else who collects who you collect, and then it goes and finds all the artists that you don't have yet that all those people have. So it's like, I'm not explaining it well, but it's a really great way to surface art that you'll probably like by artists that you haven't collected yet. So yeah, I can share, if anyone's interested, you can DM me and I can share access to that. I think that's exciting because it'll hopefully break the logjam of everybody just collecting the same artists. Let's see, question, can we read your master's thesis somewhere? Is it published? It is. It's a little cringy. It is on artnome.com. And I think if you just do search Artnome master's thesis, it'll pop up. So I wrote it from 2007 to 2010. And it was really about my transition as an analog artist into the digital world, and what digital art, what affordances come with digital art, and how digital art is sort of a logical extension of analog art, even though we often see those two things at odds. Let's see, Yuri, I heard gas fees won't get much cheaper. Yeah, that's kind of what I understand too. The verse, yep, great shout out for what they've done with poetry. I think that might be the last question. I'm happy to stick around another 5 minutes if anyone has a question they want to type in or ask. And you can always find me. Oh, that is my master's thesis. That's the image there is was a live data visualization of my harmonica. So I hooked my harmonica up and made a visualization that would change based on how I felt about the way the harmonica was being played. So was pretty early into processing and generative art and things like that, because I was in this program at Mass Art that was way ahead of its time. I was just lucky to stumble into it. So a lot of this new interest around generative art, I was lucky to know a lot of these folks from early on. Oh, I don't mind. Someone's saying, do you mind? Let's see, what is your? Let's see. Did I miss a question? What is your favorite crypto NFT artwork? I don't know that I have a favorite. It changes from day to day. I always tell folks, if you really want to know what works or what artist somebody loves, people will make stuff up, but you can just go check out their collection, and that actually does a pretty good job of showing who they really like. I've been collecting this Japanese artist, Cubibian, really heavily over the last few months. He does these generative artworks that are based on this idea of an imaginary worm shop. So he calls his art worms. Like I said, I've been into generative art for decades, and I can't figure out how he makes the work that he makes. And it's just fascinating. Almost every day he does a new drop or creates a new artwork in this leftover worm series. And it fascinates me that he's been able to create like unique ones without overlapping over and over and over and over again. So Really interested in Cubibian. I'm a big fan of Iskra, who's another artist, a generative artist that sells on Tezos. You could check out the show that I curated for Feral File called Field Guide in the beginning of the year. So I often curate artists that I'm really excited about into shows. So was really excited about that show. Yep, Iskra is Point Line. Yep. And honestly, I try to keep up with a lot of the work of artists that have been in the residency as well. So I'm excited to check all of your work out too.
Well, since we're very close to this being 2 hours, I just want to close this by asking you: do you have one specific piece of advice for our creative practice? So, regardless whether it's writing, whether it's digital, whether it's analog, whether we want to be researchers, what's one thing that helped you in your life overall and kept your creativity going?
Yeah, so I'm going to share an entire article for you that I think is pretty useful. Again, not everybody agrees with me, but I found this to be a useful guide and decent advice for artists. So this is an article I referenced earlier that I wrote called "How to Be a Successful Artist." Um, and really, for me, I was thinking it's a great question. I was thinking about this yesterday. I feel so lucky that I have multiple things in my life that when I'm depressed or sad or my life's not going my way, that I can always go back to them and I'm guaranteed 100% that they will make me happy. That's such a gift, and I know people that don't have one thing, never mind three things. Never get to the point with art where art becomes this thing that's like, I know it's work for all of you because you're, many of you are professional artists, but never get to the point where you can't find joy. And often for me, when I'm struggling with my own work, it's the ability to find joy in other artists' work. So I just went to the Mass MoCA, this museum, art museum, over the weekend, and immediately my blood pressure drops, my concerns go away. I just get happy, and like my ability to know that that's there for me, like I can always go to an art museum, and I'm always gonna feel happier and feel better. Similarly, for me, swimming in lakes, I think a few people referenced that earlier. I love the water and to be in the lakes, and I love basketball. Those are my three things or whatever. But finding your three things that you can go to when it feels like the world's not going your way, you're not getting the attention you want, you're frustrated with your work, I think has really been critical for me to stay sort of buoyant and happy. And then this article that I shared, which is actually a separate set of advice, really does focus on how it's important to just keep making work. This idea that you somehow should make less work to make your work more rare is stupid. There's no other way that I can explain it. You have to make the work. And you have to make the work when it's not coming and it feels like you're making bad work. If you're making bad work, this isn't in the article either, ask yourself what's bad about it. Get curious about the crappy work that you're making on days when you feel like you can't, you're just not making the good work you want. And ask yourself if you can find a way to make it worse. Play with it. Allow yourself to kind of get lost in it, and don't get too hooked on whether or not other people are buying your work and using those external signals as to your own self-confidence or deciding like what your worth is, if your work is good or not. As soon as you give your confidence into someone else's hands and you let the rest of the world decide whether or not your work is good, you've kind of lost, right? Like, if the work is interesting to you and you enjoy making it, keep focusing on it, keep working on it, keep being curious, and eventually, folks will come around. And if not, you'll derive pleasure, intrinsic value from creating it. So try not to put too much pressure on yourself. Remind yourself that a lot of these artists that are selling for a lot right now, they were selling for nothing before. And there's really no obvious relationship between selling and great art that I can see, and I've been in the space for 4 years. There's a lot of luck there. So hang in there and do what you love, and don't let other people's opinions of your work shape how you feel about your work, and make sure that you retain that love and passion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for staying with us and for sharing your knowledge with us. I honestly can't thank you enough for your work that you do, especially in right-click save. I read almost all the articles and I listen to the podcast, which is also spectacular. Thank you for making it. And I'm pretty sure that I speak for everyone that you're very inspirational and supportive for us. And thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be able to continue to participate in this. It's one of the top ways that I've sort of expanded my network, because you do such a great job of finding, unique and creative people from all around the world. So there's not really any other initiative I can think of in a space like this or as important as this is. So I try to do as much as I can to support it, because I feel like I benefit from it as much as anybody.
Thank you. Well, guys, it was a pleasure to see you again for this class, and we'll talk soon. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. Take care.